an apology for the Septuagint. The various and conflicting opinions which have so long prevailed amongst Christians concerning this Greek version of the ancient scriptures must render an inquiry into its real rank and importance amongst the most interesting copies of biblical investigation. As the entire phraseology of the New Testament is formed on the peculiar style of the LXX, as all our doctrinal terms are taken from its vocabulary, whilst by far the greater number of its quotations are transferred from its text, it becomes of the utmost moment to decide whether the primitive Christians were right or wrong in their opinions concerning it, and whether we are warranted in maintaining opinions contrary to those which were held by all the Christian fathers, Roman Catholic Church fathers, till the days of Jerome. In all matters of faith and doctrine, as well as of discipline, a temperate appeal to the sentiments of the primitive church of the first 3 centuries has hitherto been regarded as a fair and legitimate mode of inquiry. The value of the writings of Bull, Pearson, Gray, Waterland, Horsley, Lardner, etc. is chiefly to be estimated by such a standard, but on a matter of scriptural and historical fact, like that of the universal reception of the Septuagint version, the usage and authority of the primitive church becomes absolute and paramount. As a member of the Church of England, honestly attached to the Articles and Liturgy, the author did not feel himself called upon to make any apology for this avowal of opinion, and at that time he had yet to learn that he was departing from any decision which she made on the subject of this inquiry. That's probably the Church of England he's talking about. Individuals in her communion have taken different sides in the argument, but these opinions do not affect her ecclesiastical authority. In these matters, said Bishop Burnet on the 6th article, alluding to the differences between the Hebrew and the Septuagint, our church has made no decision, and so divines are left to a just freedom in theirs. This indeed is the last view which can be taken of the question. Considering that the church had retained the use of the Septuagintal Psalms, and that their reformers avowed and expressed a high esteem for the fathers of the 3 first centuries, the author then began to think that a strong inference could be drawn in favour of his general conclusion. Even those who question such an appeal on points of doctrine or discipline can or could scarce refuse it on a question relating to the canon of Scripture. Without resigning their belief in divine superintendence, they could not admit that the universal church could have been mistaken on such a practical and fundamental question. It followed as a plain and unavoidable inference that if this Greek version of the Old Testament, be not of scriptural and canonical authority, the entire Christian church, till the days of Jerome, possessed no authentic or canonical record of the Old Testament. To avoid this painful dilemma, they at once submitted that it is not within the jurisdiction of any national church to reject as uncanonical a version of the Old Testament, which was universally acknowledged as inspired and canonical during the first 4 centuries. This Greek version was received by the immediate successors of the apostles on authority which they could not hesitate to acknowledge. They had heard it preached and quoted by the apostles. They found it more or less in every chapter of the New Testament. They knew it had been the great scaffold of building up the Christian church, and that it had been used and received among the Hellenists for nearly 300 years before the Christian era, or the Greeks, and probably the Hellenist Jews. When 400 years had passed away, could the introduction of Jerome's Latin version from the Hebrew destroy the acknowledged and canonical authority of that Greek version, which had hitherto been universally received as inspired? This new Latin version might plead, and justly plead, its right and authority to supersede the use of the italic or any other Latin version which had been translated from the LXX. But how could it destroy the authority of the original from which such versions were made? Jerome was no prophet, and he never affected to hold a prophetic office or character. He could not abrogate the usage and authority of all who had preceded or come before him. He was in no respect but as an Hebraist superior to Augustine, either in learning or talent. He was in no respect but as an Hebraeus superior to Augustine, either in learning or talent. He acted wisely and meritoriously in undertaking a Latin version from the Hebrew. He has deserved and received the thanks of the Universal Church, that would be the Roman Catholic Church, for thus demanding its attention and reverence to that divine original from which the Septuagint itself was translated. But this Latin version, however valuable, could not invalidate the previous fact that the Greek version had been de facto canonized as a providential medium of preparing both Jews and Gentiles for the reception of the gospel that had been largely incorporated with the New Testament, ratified by the citations of evangelists and apostles, and sealed with the indelible stamp of ecclesiastical consent of 400 years. And there's a reference to that at the bottom, Graves' Prologon. Yet it should ever be remembered that the reverence and respect which were paid by ancient fathers, church fathers, to this Greek version implied no disregard of degradation of the Hebrew archetype. They were prevented by providential arrangements from consulting the Hebrew text. They could not read or study a language which for so many ages had ceased to be vernacular. But this reverence of the version must always have implied an equal, if not superior, reverence of the original. Ego pro meo modulo, saith Augustine, vestigia secor apostolorum qui ipsi ultra q testimonia posturunt. They believed that for wise and gracious purposes this Greek version had become to the Gentiles what the original Hebrew had been to the Jews during the first age of the Jewish economy, and consequently that when Jews and Gentiles were brought into the same fold, both the original and the version should be regarded of coordinate authority and forming conjointly the canon of the ancient scriptures. And footnote at the bottom says, look at the appendix number 5. Now this is the basis on which we propose to erect the following inquiry. That's the author talking there. Far from aiming to introduce any novelties of doctrinal opinion, they desired only to assert the same biblical standard as that which belonged to the Universal Church until the days of Jerome, Roman Catholic Church until the days of Jerome. To expel the Greek version from that rank which it held so long in the primitive church is virtually to change the primitive canon. If they proclaimed that the canon of the Old Testament depended solely on the Hebrew text, whilst they admitted the Greek version to a conjoint alliance, they practically set up their own standard against theirs. They also declared the whole Greek church to hold a false canon. The Greek church still adhered strictly to the usage of the primitive church. The mutilation of canon could never be justified. The Greek church asserted no more than what Augustine and the early church fathers maintained and believed, and they were at full liberty in their public worship to prefer the Hebrew original to the Greek version of the Old Testament, but they had no right to denounce that version as uncanonical. The Society for Promoting Christian Knowledge then dispersed 1,500 copies of the LXX amongst the poor Greek clergy in the Levant, in the Near East. It acted wisely and discreetly and gave a sanction to the principle which they were advocating. The later canonists at that time thought proper to depart from this wise and comprehensive accordance with primitive Christianity and had thereby thrown insurmountable obstacles in the way of any general ecclesiastical reunion between the Eastern and Western Church. It would be deplorable if the Church of England should indirectly countenance this or that schism. They had hitherto been distinguished for moderation and especially for attachment to the ecclesiastical authority by the fathers of the first centuries, or the church fathers of the Roman Catholic Church of the first 3 centuries. And the author trusted that they would not be thought to differ from them on the fundamental question. But it was vain to disguise the popular feeling amongst many zealous Protestants that the Septuagint version of the Old Testament had no longer any claim to be considered of scriptural authority, that it was superseded by the Hebrew text. Whilst this essential discrepance on the canon continued popular, the author feared that unbelievers would find a plausible ground of attacking the outwork of Christianity. They would naturally object that if they did not refer to the same scriptural record as the primitive church, the Roman Catholic Church, they could not fairly appeal to her authority on any matter relating to the doctrines or facts of the Old Testament. Nor could they, the author began to think, consistently defend the plenary inspiration of the New Testament if they admitted that it was compromised such a large portion of uninspired material. As most of its quotations are taken from the LXX, the infidel will always object, those who are against it, obviously, the critic, maybe the skeptic, that by their own confession, both Christ and his apostles have founded their appeals to patriarchs and prophets on a version which they asserted to be merely human. And then the writer goes on to say that they were less assailable on the same ground to the attacks of the Roman Church. She may have reasonably affirmed that they abjured the primitive canon by reducing the Greek version to the level of a translation simply human, and they were at liberty, says the author, like the Romanists, to prefer the Hebrew to the LXX in their public worship, but they were not at liberty to renounce and condemn the latter as unscriptural or uncanonical. It sounds repetitive. They were right in condemning Rome on the subject of the Apocrypha, but they were not justified in condemning her for her reverence and veneration of the Septuagint. And she could have justly replied, you not only disregard the authority of the primitive church, but you invalidate the plenary inspiration of the New Testament. And if you object to is he talking about the church, that he's corrupted the canon, or the church talking to him, that he's corrupted the canon by the addition of apocryphal matter, they object to you. This one in particular objects to somebody else, that you have invalidated the canon by cutting off one of its coordinate members. It is on such grounds that at the time they most respectfully solicited public attention to a candid and deliberate examination of this momentous subject. And he goes on and on. In defence of every caution, it will be urged, the Septuagint is only a version, and therefore can never be esteemed of the same rank and value as an original. Such is a popular objection, but is not this begging the question at issue? Whenever a version is made by the same authority as the original, it surely becomes of equal force and authority. Thus it is with their own articles, the Latin and the English are both of equivalent authority. If the original Syro-Chaldaic of St. Matthew's Gospel had been then extant, admitting that hypothesis, or out of the picture, not in use, it's gone, long gone, unused, it would not have been superior to the present Greek version. Or if they had the Hebrew archetype of the Jewish wars of Josephus, it would not be of higher value than their Greek translation at the time. And he says that it was generally acknowledged that they didn't have the original words of Jesus or his disciples recorded in the language in which they were spoken. It was scarcely credible that the poor woman who came out of the coast of Tyre and Sidon could have uttered her cries and lamentations in Greek. She spoke the native language of her country. It was Syro-Phoenician or Syro-Chaldaic, and the same mixed language with some variety of dialect prevailed at that time over Judea, Samaria and Galilee. There seems the highest probability that most of the Saviour's conversation with the scribes and Pharisees, and that all his addresses to the common people, were spoken in a vernacular tongue, or that vernacular tongue. But when it was subsequently ordered that the New Testament should be composed in Hellenistic Greek, they were enabled by that divine power which they termed inspiration. These people, these writers, this author termed inspiration to convert this provincial and transient dialect into its present fixed and enduring form. Now, this kind of inspiration seemed closely analogous, although of a higher grade, to that which the early fathers, church fathers, Roman Catholic church fathers, attributed to the translators of the Septuagint. The first were enabled to translate without any important error the exact meaning of Syro-Chaldaic words into their present Greek form, or that Greek form. The other were enabled to translate their native Hebrew into expressions, which is probably like idioms, which should hereafter be received and accommodated to the Greek of the New Testament, and they should forever speak with much reserve and humility on that mysterious subject. Much of the discredit which attaches to the Septuagint, simply on account of its being a version, would be instantly removed by considering that in no other way than as a canonical version of the Hebrew could it have brought about the great objects for which it was ordained. The Hellenistic Jews, when they ceased to be able to read their native Hebrew, could not have been addressed in any other manner. It was only by a version of the ancient scriptures that they could retain a knowledge of the promises made to their ancestors. And why should that version be deemed of inferior authority if it was designed not only for their personal benefit but to carry forward the ulterior purposes of the Christian dispensation? Why should the version be deemed inferior to the original when the original itself, without that version, would have been utterly unintelligible and thus incompetent to bring about the final purposes of the Jewish economy? The force of this reasoning would be at once apparent if we suppose for a moment that the Septuagint had never existed. The Hebrew language would then have ceased to be vernacular several hundred years before the Christian era, but no Greek version could have aided to supply its place. In that case, the Jews would have wandered far and wide over the east and west, but they would have had no scriptures to remind them of their patriarchs and prophets. It must have all depended on unwritten traditions and on dubious historical reminiscences, so it's all reliant on the oral, the verbal, and historical memories, right, or reflections. In the fullness of time, the era of Christianity would have arrived, but where would have been the people awaiting its advent and preparing to welcome its tidings? The gospel is preached in Judea by Christ and the evangelists in a native dialect, and various references are made to Moses and the prophets to prove that the great prophet had come into the world. But how were they to verify these allegations when they could not consult the Hebrew text? The apostles travelled into Asia Minor and Greece, and they published the same tidings in the Greek tongue. But who are to be their hearers? Who are to be the hearers? The Jews? They had no intelligible scriptures in their hands. The Gentiles, to whom such Hebrew Greek on this hypothesis would have been equally unintelligible? The New Testament was subsequently composed in this peculiar Greek, with all its references to the Old Testament exclusively directed to the Hebrew. Who is there able to read and interpret it? Or who then is there able to read and interpret it at that particular time? The Syro-Chaldaic dialect passes away, or it's confined to the knowledge of a few. How then are the tidings of the gospel to be proclaimed to the heathen world?